There are certain things in a family that look flawless from the outside, right up until the moment they don't. A Sunday dinner where the pot roast is still steaming, the good silver laid out in perfect rows, the oldest generation seated at the head of the table, the grandchildren fighting over the last dinner roll, and a single candle burning on the mantel for someone who is no longer with us. It looks like a photograph. It looks like the kind of family other people envy on their way home from their own smaller, messier houses. It only takes one sentence to turn that photograph into a crime scene. I know because I watched it happen at my own dinner table, in my own home, to my own family. And by the time it was over, I understood something I will never forget. The people who love you the most and the people who are quietly calculating what you're worth can sit at the exact same table, use the exact same tone of voice, and you will not be able to tell them apart until it's almost too late. My name is Elena Whitfield. Everyone calls me Lena. I am the Chief Financial Officer of the Whitfield Group, my husband's family real estate and hospitality company, and I have spent the last 14 years of my professional life reading the things people don't say out loud, the numbers underneath the smile, the debt underneath the confidence, the fear underneath the calm. I thought that skill made me hard to fool. I was wrong, almost dead wrong. And it nearly cost me my marriage, my sister-in-law her sanity, and an innocent 19-year-old girl her life. My husband's family home sits on 4 acres of Newport, Rhode Island coastline, a gray-shingled, glass-walled compound that the architecture magazines love to photograph at golden hour. Everyone in town calls it the Whitfield House, the way you'd refer to a lighthouse or a landmark. It's wired like something out of a spy film, motion sensor lighting that switches on the moment your car turns up the gravel drive, cameras tucked into the eaves of every porch, smart locks on every door, blinds that lower themselves at dusk whether or not anyone is home to see them do it. My father-in-law, Walter Whitfield, built half his fortune putting exactly this kind of security technology into luxury properties up and down the East Coast. People joked that you couldn't sneeze on his lawn without the system logging it. Funny thing about houses like that. Everyone assumes a place with that many cameras can't have a blind spot. They're wrong. All it takes is one man with the master password, and the most surveilled house in New England can grow a shadow nobody else is allowed to see into. That was the night that changed everything for us. The night the house was lit up exactly the way it always was. Gate to porch to upstairs hallway. Security cameras blinking their calm red dot in the corners of the courtyard. Blinds sliding down right on schedule like nothing in the world was wrong. Our housekeeper, Dolores, who has been with the Whitfields since before I ever set foot in that house, carried out a tureen of her clam chowder and set it in front of my husband. "Eat it while it's hot, Daniel. The seafood came in fresh this morning." My husband murmured something back without looking up from his phone. My sister-in-law, Claire, was already fussing with the clasp of her bracelet, and her husband, Marcus, pulled her chair out for her with the kind of smooth, unhurried courtesy that always made the rest of us look slightly clumsy by comparison. I sat beside Daniel and noticed that my father-in-law hadn't touched his silverware. Above the mantel behind him hung the portrait of my late mother-in-law, Eleanor, painted the year before she died, her expression caught somewhere between amusement and warning, the way it always seemed to be. Whenever the whole family gathered for dinner, Dolores lit a small votive candle beneath that portrait before she served the first course. It had become its own kind of ritual. Nobody ever discussed it. It simply happened, the way certain habits do in families that have buried someone they loved. The smell of that candle, vanilla wax mixed with roast beef, garlic butter, and buttered rolls, is one of those scents that hits you somewhere below language. It still catches me off guard sometimes, even now. Claire forced a bright smile to cut through the heaviness in the room. Dad, you called an emergency family dinner. Please tell me it's good news. Are you finally buying us all beach houses? Watch your mouth in front of your mother's portrait, Daniel snapped. Stop joking about money. Marcus reached over and patted his wife's hand, his voice as smooth as poured honey. She's kidding, Daniel. It's just nice for everyone to sit down together. I glanced at him the way I always did, carefully. The way you'd glance at a contract you suspected had a clause buried on page 9. Marcus never wasted a word. He measured every syllable before he let it leave his mouth. Most people mistook that for good manners. I had spent 2 decades as an accountant, learning to look past the smile and into the ledger behind it, and I knew better. The smoother a sentence sounds, the harder it usually is to see what's actually underneath it. Walter set down his fork. It wasn't loud, the small clink of metal against china, but the whole table went quiet anyway. He sat up straighter, his silver hair combed back the way it always was, his face doing that thing it did when he was about to say something he'd already rehearsed 100 times in his head. Only his thumb gave him away, rubbing slow, absent circles against the rim of his water glass, the kind of tiny nervous habit you'd never catch unless you'd spent years learning to watch for exactly that. At the end of this month, he said, I'm holding a wedding. Daniel's hand froze in midair, his fork suspended over his plate. Claire, who had been reaching for her wine, turned to stone. Dolores, standing near the sideboard, dropped a serving spoon onto the hardwood floor with a clatter that seemed to echo for a full second too long. I was sure I had misheard him. What did you just say? Daniel asked, his voice dropping low. Walter looked directly at his son. I'm holding a wedding. Her name is Ivy Sinclair. She's 19 years old. The room went cold in a way no thermostat could explain. 19. At 19, a girl should be worrying about a chemistry final, not a diamond ring. She should still be calling her mother to ask what the weather's doing before she leaves her dorm. And here was my father-in-law, 68 years old, announcing he was going to marry her, right underneath his dead wife's portrait, like the woman in that painting couldn't hear a word of it. Claire let out a short, ugly laugh. Are you serious right now, Dad? 19? Do you have any idea what people are going to say about this family? Mom would be humiliated. Daniel slammed his water glass down hard enough that it sloshed over the rim. When did you even meet her? Who introduced you? Do you understand what this is going to do to us? I know exactly what I'm doing, Walter said, flat and final. You know, Daniel said, his eyes going glassy and red, and you're doing it anyway. Is this actually love, Dad? Or is she just after everything you have? Before the words had even finished settling over the table, Marcus looked up. He didn't jump in right away. He waited, the way you wait for a fire to catch before you blow on it. Forgive me if I'm overstepping, Walter, but the Whitfield Group works with institutional partners, banks, insurers. If word gets out that the CEO's father is marrying a 19-year-old, it's going to look like this family is unraveling. And honestly, Eleanor's estate, the shares she left Daniel and Claire, all of that probably needs to be clearly separated before somebody new moves into this house. I set my fork down. People say you only find out who the rats are once the house catches fire. That's not entirely true. Sometimes you don't need a fire at all. The mere smell of money changing hands is enough to make every rat in the walls stick its head out at once. Robert. I stopped myself and corrected the name in my head. It had been a long week, and I'd been reading through vendor contracts for the Providence property all afternoon, and for one disorienting second, Marcus's careful little speech reminded me so much of every contract clause I'd ever had to flag that I nearly called him by the wrong name entirely. "Marcus," I said instead, "let's not talk shares over dinner." Walter's eyes cut toward his son-in-law, and for just a second, something genuinely dangerous moved behind them. "Marcus, do not do the math on Whitfield family business for me." Marcus dipped his head immediately, all humility. "Of course. I only worry about this family." Claire seemed to draw courage from her husband's words. She turned to her father, her voice cracking. "I can't stop you from marrying whoever you want, Dad. But if you bring a 19-year-old girl into this house and tomorrow her name is on our real estate, on our trust, are we just supposed to sit here and say nothing? Mom hasn't even been gone 2 years. Have you forgotten that the room at the end of the east hallway used to be her hospice room?" All the color drained out of Daniel's face at that sentence. The room at the end of the first-floor hallway had been where my mother-in-law spent the final months of her life. It still had the hospital bed in it, the high-end medical-grade air purifier, the locked medicine cabinet, the emergency call button screwed into the wall by her nightstand, and a side door that opened directly onto the garden so her hospice nurses could come and go without disturbing the rest of the house. Nobody had gone in there casually since she died. For Daniel and Claire, it wasn't just an unused guest room. It was the last physical space in the house that still held their mother in it. Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Dolores, tomorrow I need you to have the room at the end of the hall prepared. New curtains, have the air purifier serviced, restock the medicine cabinet, check the emergency call button. I'll be using it." Daniel shot up out of his chair so fast it nearly tipped over. "You're putting her in Mom's room?" Claire pressed a hand to her chest, tears spilling over before she could stop them. Even I felt something close and painful rise in my throat. Moving a 19-year-old girl into that specific room, for any reason at all, felt like rubbing salt straight into a wound that had never fully closed. I tried to keep my voice level. "Dad, if Ivy's moving in, what's her legal status? Are you signing a marriage license?" Walter looked at me. There was a warning in his eyes, but underneath it, something else. Something that looked unmistakably like exhaustion. Bone-deep, years-old exhaustion. "We're not registering anything yet. Her paperwork is complicated. For now, it's a private commitment ceremony here at the house. No guests, no announcement." That answer didn't put anyone's mind at ease. If anything, it made everything worse. A wedding with no marriage certificate. A ceremony with no guests. A teenager moved into a dead woman's hospice room. Walter Whitfield had spent his entire adult life guarding his family's reputation like it was a vault. Why would a man like that choose the one path guaranteed to blow the doors off that vault in public? "What are you hiding?" Daniel demanded through his teeth. Walter stood. The hallway lights clicked on automatically, tracing his path as he walked past Eleanor's portrait, slowing for a fraction of a second without ever turning his head toward it. "I'll say this once. The ceremony is at the end of the month. If any of you are too ashamed to attend, don't." Outside, rain had started hammering against the glass atrium roof. A heavy, insistent knocking, like someone standing at a door that kept refusing to open for them. Dolores bent to pick up a napkin that had fallen and muttered, half to herself, half to the house itself, "This place is lit up like Christmas morning, and it's never once felt this dark." I watched my father-in-law's silhouette disappear down the hallway, and I remember thinking, very clearly, that I had absolutely no idea who Ivy Sinclair was. I didn't know why a man who had spent his entire life protecting his reputation would suddenly choose a path guaranteed to make his own children despise him. All I knew was that after that dinner, our house, the one with cameras in every corner, the one that never had a blind spot, had its first dark zone. After that dinner, the house kept running exactly the way it always had. At 6 a.m, the blinds rose on their own. At 7, Dolores set out breakfast. At 8, Daniel backed his car down the drive toward the company's Providence office, and the courtyard cameras tracked every step he took to get there. The routine was flawless. It was also, I realized within a few days, a shell. Underneath all that clockwork precision, everyone in that house was quietly falling apart. Daniel didn't bring Ivy up again in front of his father. He was too controlled for that, or maybe too proud. But every night, without fail, I'd find him standing in front of Eleanor's portrait in the hallway, not saying anything, just standing there, with his hands in his pockets like a man visiting a grave. I knew the anger sitting in his chest wasn't only about Ivy. It was about watching his mother be quietly, methodically edged out of the house she had spent 30 years turning into a home. Claire handled it differently. She called me constantly, sometimes twice a day. "Lena, you're the CFO. You have to keep your eyes open. If Dad lets that girl get her name onto any of the trusts, we lose everything we're owed." I'd tell her nothing had actually happened yet, that we shouldn't build a courtroom out of a rumor. She'd scoff at me down the phone line. "You're too nice, that's your problem. There is no 19-year-old on this earth who marries a 68-year-old man because she loves him. She just hasn't shown her real face yet." I didn't defend Ivy, because at that point I genuinely had no idea what kind of person she was. But listening to Claire, I could hear that her fear wasn't purely about protecting her mother's memory. There was a much more specific, much more personal fear underneath it. The fear of watching her own slice of the family pie quietly shrink to nothing. People love to wrap greed in the language of loyalty. The nicer the wrapping paper, the uglier what's inside tends to be. Marcus, as always, played a longer, quieter game. He never called me directly, never argued with Daniel in the open. Whenever he was in the house, he simply sat close to his wife and murmured things that sounded, on the surface, like reasonable advice. "Calm down, honey. Big decisions like this need to go through paperwork properly. Your dad can do whatever he wants with his own life, but the assets your mother left specifically to you and Daniel need to be legally protected. This isn't about greed. It's about doing this the right way." He said the phrase, "this isn't about greed," so many times over the following 2 weeks that I started hearing it in my sleep. In my experience, and 14 years of forensic accounting teaches you this fast, people who are genuinely not motivated by greed rarely feel the need to announce it that early and that often. While the rest of the family vibrated with tension like a plucked wire, Walter himself became eerily, almost frighteningly calm. He hired contractors to come quietly redo the room at the end of the east hallway. New curtains, a serviced air purifier, a tested emergency call button, a rekeyed electronic lock, a fully restocked medicine cabinet. He told the workers explicitly not to discuss the job with the rest of the office staff. As the person who signed off on every invoice that came through the Whitfield Group's accounts payable system, I was the one who ended up frowning down at the paperwork. It wasn't redecoration. It read like a hospital intake list. Pharmaceutical-grade wound dressings, a new blood pressure cuff, a pulse oximeter, prescription pain patches billed under a code I didn't recognize, a cardiac monitoring wristband. I found him in his study that afternoon and set the folder on his desk. "Dad, You're ordering a lot of medical equipment. Is Ivy sick? He glanced up at the invoices in my hand, his voice flat as poured concrete. She's fragile. Just process the payments. Do you want me to arrange a private nurse for her? No, I'll handle it myself. He gathered his files and walked out before I could ask anything else. I stood there in the study, feeling more lost than I had all week. If this girl was a gold digger, chasing a rich old man's fortune, why would she need what looked like an entire home pharmacy? And if she was genuinely, seriously ill, why on earth wouldn't Walter simply tell his own children the truth so they'd stop assuming the very worst about him? A man who had spent his whole career building his identity around control and precision should have known better than anyone that the more you hide, the darker the story people invent to fill in the blank. The day of the ceremony arrived faster than any of us wanted it to. Walter had called it a wedding, but it felt more like a hostage negotiation dressed up in linen tablecloths. No arch, no string quartet, no white runner down the lawn. Just the living room cleared out for a small catered lunch, a handful of distant relatives invited out of obligation, and every single one of them exchanging looks loaded with curiosity and quiet disgust the moment they walked through the door. Dolores arranged the appetizer trays with a heavy sigh. What kind of wedding is this? It feels colder than a funeral in here. I heard her, and I couldn't disagree. I felt exactly the same way. A little before 10 that morning, the iron gates swung open on their own, and a black Range Rover rolled up the gravel drive. Walter stepped out first, walked around to the passenger side, and opened the door himself. That was the first time I ever laid eyes on Ivy Sinclair. She wore a plain white sundress, nothing designer about it, her hair pulled back into a low, unfussy ponytail. Her face had the pale, drained look of someone recovering from a long fever. She was thin enough that her collarbones showed sharply above the neckline of the dress. No jewelry, no makeup to speak of. Nothing about her carried even a trace of the excitement you'd expect from a young woman stepping into a life of enormous wealth. Both her hands were wrapped tightly around the strap of a cheap, worn canvas duffel bag, the kind you buy at a drugstore, not the kind you'd expect a bride to be carrying. She kept her eyes fixed on the pavement in front of her, as though looking up even once would invite the entire yard to start throwing stones. Standing beside me, Claire made a small, sharp sound of contempt. She's a good little actress, isn't she? Plain white dress, no makeup, very butter wouldn't melt. Marcus leaned in close and murmured something meant only for the two of them, but pitched just loud enough for me to catch every word. People who know how to manipulate the elderly never need to be loud about it, honey. It wasn't a knife of a sentence. It didn't need to be. It cut clean through the moment anyway. Walter led Ivy inside. The relatives began whispering behind their coffee cups, openly scanning her from head to toe. Someone murmured, just loud enough to carry, "Lord, that girl looks barely old enough to drive, let alone get married." Someone else answered, "They're rich. Around here, anything goes if you've got the money to back it up." Ivy heard every word of it. I know she did, because I watched her shoulders flinch each time. But she didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply stayed close to Walter's side, her face bloodless. When she passed beneath Eleanor's portrait in the front hall, she stopped walking entirely. She stood there and stared up at it for a long moment, and then, before anyone could remind her of her place in this family, she pressed her hands together and bowed her head. It wasn't the polite little curtsy of a new bride being introduced to a household. It was heavier than that. It looked, unmistakably, like an apology. a silent, terrified one.
Daniel stood beside me, jaw clenched so hard I could hear him breathing through his nose. "What right does she have to bow to my mother?" he muttered.
I didn't answer, because I honestly didn't understand it either. If Ivy had genuinely come here chasing a fortune, she should have been radiant, charming, working the room, trying to win Walter's children over one by one. Instead, she looked like someone who'd been pushed onto a stage to perform a role she was desperately trying to refuse. The ceremony itself lasted less than 4 minutes. Walter simply stood in front of the fireplace and announced, "This is Ivy. She'll be living in this house from now on. I expect everyone to treat her with respect." One of the distant cousins immediately asked, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "So, have you actually filed the marriage license, Walter?" The room went dead silent. "Ivy's paperwork has some complications," Walter said. "Once everything's settled, I'll take care of it." I watched the relatives trade knowing glances over their wine glasses. Claire actually smirked. Marcus looked down at his teacup to hide the shape of his own smile. No marriage license, but he was calling it a wedding. No public announcement, but he was moving her permanently into the house. The longer Walter talked, the worse the whole thing sounded. Lunch was almost impossible to sit through. Ivy barely touched her plate. Dolores set a piece of grilled salmon in front of her, and Ivy murmured a quiet, "Thank you," before setting her fork down untouched. Walter watched her the entire meal, a flicker of something that looked disturbingly like worry crossing his face every few minutes. Not the warm, doting worry of a new husband, but something colder and more clinical. The way you'd watch a patient for signs of relapse. That night, after every guest had gone home and the caterers had packed up their trays, Walter led Ivy down the hallway toward the room at the far end, the one that had been Eleanor's. I followed at a distance, close enough to see, far enough to stay out of the way. Ivy's footsteps were so light against the hard wood, they barely made a sound at all. The room had been transformed. New beige curtains, fresh linens on the hospital bed, the air purifier humming low and steady in the corner. The medicine cabinet mounted against the far wall, locked. On the nightstand sat a pitcher of water, a box of tissues, a blood pressure cuff, and a brand new emergency call button, its red light blinking softly. If you didn't already know the context, you would have sworn you were standing in a private hospital suite, not a bridal chamber. I watched Walter. He didn't move like a man who had just brought his young wife into their private quarters. There was no tenderness in it, no pride, none of the smugness you might expect from an older man who'd just gotten exactly what he wanted. He simply walked the perimeter of the room, checking every outlet, testing the emergency button once, then turned to Ivy and asked, "Where's your medication?" Ivy kept her eyes on the floor. "In my bag, sir." That word, "sir," landed on my ears like a dropped glass. If this was any kind of a wedding, even an unofficial one, she should have been calling him by his first name. Or, at the very least, fumbling through some kind of newlywed awkwardness. Instead, she said "sir," with the easy, practiced fluency of someone who had been saying it for years. Walter didn't correct her. He simply took the bag of pill bottles from her hands and began arranging them methodically inside the cabinet. I asked softly, "Dad, do you want me to have staff bring anything else down for her?" He turned, and his face hardened instantly. "No. Starting tomorrow, meals get left outside the door. Nobody enters this room without my direct permission." Not even Dolores to clean? No one. At that, Ivy's head came up, her lips parting like she wanted to say something. But Walter had already turned toward her. You need to rest, kid. Another word that snagged in my ears. Kid. Sure, an older man might casually call a young woman kid, but in this particular context, every single word out of his mouth felt like it had been sharpened on purpose. A girl brought in as a supposed new bride who calls her husband sir, who gets called kid in return, and who's being housed in a room outfitted like a private clinic. If this was a marriage, it was the coldest one I had ever witnessed. And if it was actually about caretaking, why on earth build an entire fake wedding as the cover story for it? Before I could untangle any of that further, Claire's voice cut through the hallway behind me. You're really keeping her locked up in there, aren't you? She stood at the far end of the hall, Marcus right beside her, Daniel just behind them both, his face carved out of stone. Walter shut the medicine cabinet. Claire, go upstairs. Claire let out a bitter laugh. This was my own mother's room, and we haven't been allowed to set foot in it in 2 years. But some stranger gets to move in the same day she arrives? Do you think that's acceptable? Ivy shrank back against the headboard, all the color gone from her face. Please, ma'am, she whispered. Don't. I am not your ma'am, Claire snapped. Don't talk to me. The words landed like a slap. Ivy dropped her head, her shoulders trembling faintly. Daniel looked at his father, his voice low and dangerous. Dad, if you have any respect left for Mom at all, you will not do this. Walter stayed silent for a few seconds before walking past him toward the door. As he passed, he said, quietly enough that only Daniel and I could hear it, "There are things you don't understand right now." Daniel scoffed. Then explain it to me so I do. Walter said nothing. He kept walking. People always say that once trust breaks, it never fully mends. But I was starting to learn something worse than that. Sometimes all it takes is the wrong kind of silence, held for just long enough to shatter trust completely and all at once. That same night, not an hour after Ivy had been settled into the room, Walter picked up the phone and called Grant Pierce, the lead systems technician who'd installed and maintained every piece of smart infrastructure in that house since the day it was built. Grant knew every wire, every port, every override code in the place better than anyone alive, Walter included. He arrived within 20 minutes, still in his company polo, tablet tucked under one arm. I was standing in the living room when I overheard Walter's instructions. Switch the cameras covering the east hallway to privacy mode. Disable the motion sensors outside her room. Change the access codes and route them exclusively through my administrator account. Grant hesitated. Sir, if we take the hallway cameras offline, the security log is going to have a permanent blind spot in it. Do it anyway. Daniel overheard this from the stairs and came storming down. Why are you turning off the cameras, Dad? Walter didn't even look at his son. It's my own private business. Daniel let out a laugh that sounded more like choking. Our company sells cameras and smart locks and home security systems to half of New England, and you're carving a blind spot into your own house? Marcus, standing near his wife, spoke up gently. Too gently. Daniel has a point, honestly. An honest man doesn't need to fear the light. That single sentence was gasoline thrown straight onto an open flame. Claire looked at her father like she was looking at a total stranger for the first time in her life. Walter shot Marcus a look so sharp that Marcus immediately dropped his eyes to his phone and pretended to be reading a text. Continue, Walter told Grant. I watched the camera icons on Grant's tablet fade to gray one by one. The motion sensors in the hallway blink out, and access rights transfer entirely into Walter's private admin login. The whole process took less than 4 minutes. It was clean, efficient, and it left me deeply, unmistakably uneasy. This house had always been Walter's proudest achievement precisely because it had no blind spots. And now, with his own 2 hands, he had carved one directly into the middle of it. That night, dinner was set outside Ivy's door exactly as ordered. A small tray, pureed soup, finely chopped vegetables, a glass of water, and a tiny paper cup with a few pills rattling inside it. Walter opened the door, took the tray in himself, and shut it again almost instantly. The door closed so fast that Dolores only caught the barest glimpse of Ivy sitting on the edge of the bed, hunched forward, arms wrapped tight around her own stomach. Dolores found me on the landing afterward and whispered, "Lena, I'm telling you, that girl does not look like a bride. She looks like a patient." I nodded, but didn't dare say anything more. My own head was a tangle of contradictions. Claire despised Ivy on sight. Daniel was furious at his father in a way I'd never seen before. Marcus was quietly, carefully planting seeds of doubt in every conversation he touched. And Walter was making an already terrible situation look worse every single time he tried to keep it hidden. Around 10 that night, I passed the top of the stairs and found Daniel standing there, staring down the darkened hallway. The lights at that end had dimmed to almost nothing, leaving only a thin sliver glowing beneath the closed bedroom door. "What do you think he's doing in there?" he asked me. "Honestly, I don't know," I told him. He gripped the handrail so hard his knuckles went white. "I'm scared, Lena. I'm scared that one day we're going to open that door and I'm not going to recognize my own father anymore." I didn't answer him, because at that exact moment, from the far end of the hallway, a small, sharp sound reached us. The sound of glass shattering against something hard, followed by a silence so complete it felt like the whole house was holding its breath. Just a small noise. But in a home that had gone this quiet, this watchful, it was enough to raise the hair on my arms. From the night Walter disabled the cameras in the east hallway, our house felt like it had been gouged of one eye. Every other system still ran with perfect precision. The gates recognized our cars and swung open without a hitch. The yard lights clicked on for anyone crossing the lawn. The living room blinds still rose at exactly 6 every morning. But whenever my gaze drifted toward the end of that hallway, something in my chest tightened involuntarily. A house that used to be lit from corner to corner had grown a shadow. And a shadow inside a family, once it takes root, never stays contained to a single room. It spreads, from a locked door to suspicious glances at the dinner table, from an offhand remark to a tear in the fabric of trust that no amount of apologizing can fully stitch back together. During the day, the room at the end of the hall made almost no sound at all. Dolores left breakfast outside the door each morning. 10 minutes later, Walter would open it, take the tray, and disappear back inside. Lunch and dinner followed the same pattern. The trays went in full and came back out half-eaten, sometimes barely touched. Some days, only the water glass was empty, the soup gone cold and untouched beside it. Dolores stared down at one of those returned trays one evening, shaking her head. "How is that girl supposed to survive eating like this? She's thin as a reed already." Claire, passing through the kitchen, sneered without breaking stride. "You're too soft on her, Dolores. Maybe she just thinks our food isn't fancy enough for her taste." Dolores said nothing back. She'd been with this family since before Eleanor passed, long enough to know exactly whose temper to avoid and when to keep quiet. But I saw her hands trembling slightly as she wiped down the tray afterward. The people who've lived the longest inside a family rarely raise their voices the way the younger ones do. They've simply watched enough of life to understand exactly how fast good manners can curdle into cruelty, and they learn to brace for it early. Claire's calls to me got worse before they got better. She would phone at odd hours, during my lunch break, during a board call, once at 11 at night while I was brushing my teeth. Always circling back to the same fear, dressed up in slightly different language each time. Have you seen the trust documents lately, Lena? Has Dad said anything to you about updating his will? What if she's already talked him into changing the beneficiary on the Newport property? I told her, over and over, that nothing had changed in any of the filings I had access to. She never seemed to fully believe me. One evening, about 10 days after the ceremony, Marcus caught me alone in the study while I was reconciling the month's vendor invoices. He leaned against the doorframe with a folder tucked under his arm, his expression carefully arranged into something between concern and reluctant duty. "Lena, can I run something by you, purely hypothetically?" "Go ahead," I said, not looking up from my screen. "If, and I mean purely hypothetically, Walter were to become incapacitated in some way, medically or otherwise, who currently holds decision-making authority over the estate? Is there a standing power of attorney on file?" I finally looked up at him. "Why are you asking me that?" He shrugged, a little too casually. "No reason. I just think, given everything that's happening with this Ivy situation, it might be smart for the family to have some kind of contingency plan in place, in case things get complicated. Purely as a precaution, for Claire's protection, really." I told him there was no standing power of attorney that I was aware of, and that any change to the estate structure would require Walter's direct, documented consent. Nothing could move without his signature, full stop. Marcus nodded slowly, thanked me, and left the folder resting closed on the corner of my desk without another word. I didn't think much of it in the moment. I had 2 vendor disputes and a payroll discrepancy pulling my attention that week, and Marcus's hypothetical question got filed away in the back of my mind alongside a dozen other small, strange things nobody in that house seemed able to fully explain. Looking back now, I understand exactly what that conversation actually was. It wasn't hypothetical curiosity. It was reconnaissance. Marcus wasn't asking me a question. He was mapping the terrain before he made his move. The strange visitor showed up about 2 weeks after the ceremony, on a Thursday evening when the fog had rolled in thick off the water and swallowed the streetlights whole. I was pulling into the driveway after a late board meeting when my headlights caught a man standing just outside the gate, hands jammed in the pockets of a dark jacket, staring up at the house like he was memorizing the layout of it. He wasn't dressed like anyone from Newport. Nothing about him fit. Not his shoes, not his posture, not the way he stood so still while everyone else in this neighborhood moved like they had somewhere important to be. I slowed the car. He turned, met my eyes through the windshield for one long second, and then walked off down the road without a word, unhurried, like a man who knew exactly how much time he had. I told Daniel about it that night. He frowned, rubbed a hand over his face, and said he'd have the security company review the gate camera footage in the morning. Footage that, I remembered with a small chill, only existed because the cameras at the gate hadn't been part of what Walter disabled. The east hallway was dark. The rest of the house still saw everything. The footage showed the man standing at the gate for 11 full minutes. He never tried the intercom. He never approached the door. He simply watched the house, then left. When Daniel zoomed in on the still frame, none of us recognized him. But something about the stillness of him, The patience of him stuck with me in a way I couldn't shake. 3 days later, Dolores mentioned, almost in passing while folding towels in the laundry room, that she'd found a folded slip of paper tucked under the wiper blade of Walter's car that morning. She said Walter had read it standing in the driveway, gone completely white, and then torn it into small pieces and dropped them into the outdoor trash can rather than the kitchen one. I went out to the bins that evening under the excuse of taking out the recycling and, feeling more than a little ridiculous, fished the torn pieces out and pieced them back together on the kitchen counter once everyone else had gone to bed. It wasn't much. Just a few fragments of handwriting, blocky and pressed hard into the paper like whoever wrote it had been angry the entire time. I could make out a partial phrase, "Oh, her mother," and, on a separate scrap, "Last chance before I make this public." No signature, no return address, just those two jagged fragments of a threat, and the unmistakable sense that whatever Walter was hiding in that locked room at the end of the hall had a second party involved. Someone with a personal stake in Ivy's past. Someone circling the edges of this family with a very specific kind of leverage in hand. I didn't tell Claire. I didn't tell Marcus. Some instinct in me, the same instinct that had spent 14 years learning to trust the numbers over the story people told about the numbers, said that whatever was happening here, the fewer people who knew what I'd found, the safer that information would stay. I told Daniel, and only Daniel, and he sat across the kitchen table from me with the torn scraps of paper spread out between us, like the pieces of a puzzle neither of us had the full picture for yet. "You think Dad's being blackmailed," he said. It wasn't a question. "I think somebody out there believes he owes them something connected to Ivy's mother. And I think whatever it is, your father is scared enough of it becoming public that he's willing to let his entire family think the absolute worst of him rather than explain it." Daniel sat with that for a long moment, turning his water glass slowly in his hands, the exact same nervous habit his father had. "Then we need to find out who that man at the gate is, before whoever he's working for decides 11 minutes of watching isn't enough anymore." The night everything finally broke open started like any other. Dinner service ran on schedule. The blinds lowered themselves at dusk. Dolores left the tray outside the east hallway door at 7:15, same as always. I remember exactly what I was doing at 11 that night. Sitting up in bed, scrolling through a vendor contract I hadn't finished reviewing, Daniel already half asleep beside me, when the sound tore through the entire house. It wasn't the small, contained noise of glass against a nightstand this time. It was a scream. High, raw, and absolutely unmistakable. The kind of sound that goes straight through a house's walls and lodges itself somewhere behind your ribs. It came from the end of the hallway, and it did not stop. Daniel was out of bed before I'd even fully processed what I'd heard. I ran after him, my bare feet slapping against the hardwood, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Claire's door flew open at the same moment, Marcus right behind her, both of them stumbling into the hall half-dressed. The screaming kept going, ragged, desperate, cracking in the middle like whoever was making that sound had nothing left to make it with. Daniel hit the bedroom door at a dead run. It didn't budge. The new electronic lock held firm, its small light blinking a steady, useless green. He hit it again, harder, throwing his whole shoulder into it, and I heard something in the frame crack. "Ivy!" he shouted. "Dad, open this door!" No answer came from inside except the screaming, and underneath it now, a second sound. Walter's voice, low and frantic, saying something we couldn't make out through the door. Daniel didn't wait for a third try. He stepped back, drove his heel into the door just beside the handle, and the lock finally gave way in a spray of splintered wood and shattered plastic housing. The door swung open so hard it slammed against the wall. What we found inside stopped every single one of us cold. Ivy was on the floor beside the bed, her body curled in on itself, convulsing, one hand clawing weakly at her own throat. Walter was on his knees beside her, one arm braced under her shoulders, the other hand pressing something, a small vial, an EpiPen, I couldn't tell in the chaos, against the side of her arm. The nightstand lamp lay shattered on the floor a few feet away, glass scattered across the hard wood in a wide, glittering arc. Walter's hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep his grip steady. "Call an ambulance," he said, without even looking up at us, his voice stripped of every ounce of the ice-cold control he'd carried around for weeks. "Now! Go!" Claire stood frozen in the doorway, one hand pressed over her mouth. Marcus, to his credit, was the one who actually moved, phone already at his ear, rattling off the address to the 911 dispatcher in a voice that stayed remarkably level. I dropped to my knees on Ivy's other side, my accountant's instincts utterly useless against what I was looking at, and did the only thing I could think to do. I took her free hand and held it, and I told her, over and over, that help was coming, that she wasn't alone. Her convulsions slowed within a minute or two, whatever was in that injection working fast, but her breathing stayed shallow and wet-sounding, her lips a shade of gray-blue that no 19-year-old's lips should ever be. Walter kept 2 fingers pressed to the pulse point at her wrist, counting under his breath, his whole body rigid with a kind of fear I had genuinely never seen on him before. Not once. Not in 14 years of watching this man run boardrooms and hostile negotiations without so much as blinking. "What is wrong with her?" Daniel demanded, kneeling beside his father now, his earlier fury completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked almost like his own childhood fear resurfacing. "Dad, what is happening to her?" Walter didn't answer. He just kept counting her pulse, his jaw locked so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. The ambulance arrived within 11 minutes, an eternity that felt like it lasted an entire year. The paramedics moved fast and practiced, getting an oxygen mask over Ivy's face, a line into her arm, asking Walter rapid-fire questions about medication history that he answered with unsettling, immediate precision, rattling off drug names and dosages like he'd had them memorized for months. Watching him answer those questions, I understood with total certainty that whatever this was, it wasn't new. Walter Whitfield had been living inside this crisis for a very long time, before any of the rest of us ever found out it existed. They loaded Ivy onto the gurney. Walter climbed into the back of the ambulance without a single word to any of us, without so much as a glance backward. The doors shut. The ambulance pulled away down the gravel drive, lights strobing red and white across the front of a house that, for the first time in its entire existence, had absolutely nothing on its schedule to tell it what came next. We stood in the driveway in our pajamas, all 4 of us, the fog rolling cold off the water, and nobody said a single word for a long, long time. We followed the ambulance to Newport Hospital in Daniel's car, Claire and Marcus behind us in theirs, none of us speaking. The waiting room at that hour was nearly empty, just a janitor buffing the linoleum under the harsh fluorescent lights and a vending machine humming in the corner. Walter had disappeared through a set of double doors with the medical team and hadn't come back out in over an hour. When a doctor finally emerged and asked for the family of Ivy Sinclair, all 4 of us stood up at once. The doctor, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a clipboard, glanced between us with visible confusion. "I'm sorry, which of you is her family exactly?" Nobody answered right away because none of us actually knew. Walter's voice came from behind her, low and rough. I am. He stepped forward, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked every one of his 68 years, and then some. I'm her father. The word landed in that waiting room like a dropped stone in still water. Daniel actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound. Her what? Walter didn't repeat himself. He just nodded at the doctor, who continued, addressing the room at large now, apparently having decided that whatever family dynamics were unfolding here were not her problem to untangle. She's stable. We managed to control the anaphylactic reaction, but given her underlying condition, that's going to remain a serious risk factor going forward. I'd like to keep her overnight for observation. Underlying condition, Claire repeated slowly, like the words tasted strange in her mouth. What underlying condition? The doctor glanced at Walter, a silent question, permission to say more. Walter closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, something in his face had simply given up trying to hold the wall in place any longer. Aplastic anemia, he said. Severe. Diagnosed a little over a year ago. Her bone marrow has essentially stopped producing enough healthy blood cells on its own. She's been on immunosuppressive therapy and a rotation of medications to manage it, but she needs regular transfusions, and she's currently on the list for a bone marrow transplant. I'm being evaluated as a potential donor match. The waiting room went completely silent except for the hum of the vending machine. You're a donor match, Daniel repeated, working through it out loud, slow and careful, the way you'd approach a wild animal you didn't fully trust yet. Dad, why would you be a match for some teenager you supposedly just met a month ago? Walter sat down heavily in one of the waiting room chairs, elbows on his knees, and for the first time in my entire 14 years of knowing him, I watched Walter Whitfield's composure completely collapse. Because she's my daughter, he said. My biological daughter. I've known for 11 months. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed, it felt like, for a long stretch of seconds. Claire was the first to find her voice, and it came out thin and shaking. You had an affair? While you were married to Mom? No, Walter said quietly. Before. Long before I ever met your mother. I was 24. I was engaged to a woman named Margaret Sinclair for 8 months before it fell apart, badly, and it was mostly my fault. I was building the company from nothing back then, working 18-hour days, and I let that engagement die out of neglect rather than any single dramatic betrayal. Margaret left. I didn't find out she was pregnant until years later, and by then she was already married to someone else, and she made it very clear to me that she didn't want my money or my name anywhere near her daughter's life. I respected that. I sent money quietly through a lawyer for years, money she never touched, as it turns out. It sat in an account collecting dust while she raised Ivy on her own income, refusing every cent I tried to send. I never met Ivy, not once. Not until 14 months ago, when Margaret's second husband, Ivy's stepfather, called me out of nowhere and told me Margaret had passed away from a stroke, and that Ivy was alone, 17 years old, still finishing high school, with a diagnosis she couldn't afford to treat, and nobody left to help her carry it. He rubbed a hand over his face. I flew out to Ohio within 2 days. I found a terrified girl living in her dead mother's apartment, trying to keep herself in remission on rationed medication because she couldn't afford full doses, refusing to even consider reaching out to me because her mother had spent her whole childhood telling her that the Whitfields were not people she wanted anything to do with. It took me nearly a year to convince her to let me help her at all, and when she finally did agree, she made one condition absolutely non-negotiable. She did not want to be known publicly, ever, as Walter Whitfield's illegitimate daughter. She'd grown up poor and proud and fiercely private, and the idea of being paraded in front of the press and treated like some scandal made her physically sick with anxiety. She begged me to find another way. "So you invented a wedding," I said slowly, the pieces finally sliding into place in my head, even as my stomach turned over. Walter nodded, looking utterly exhausted. "It was Ivy's idea, actually, believe it or not. She said if people thought she was my wife rather than my daughter, at least there'd be a story that made sense to outsiders without them digging into her actual medical history or her mother's past. She didn't want pity. She didn't want to be the sick girl. She wanted to just quietly get the transplant evaluation done and disappear back into an ordinary life once she was well again. I told her it was a terrible plan. She told me it was better than the alternative. I let her talk me into it because I was desperate to get her somewhere safe, somewhere with round-the-clock medical access before her numbers dropped any further. I genuinely believed I could manage the fallout quietly and explain everything to all of you once she was stable enough to handle the stress of it. And instead, Daniel said, his voice hollow, "You let your own children spend a month thinking their father had lost his mind and was marrying a teenage gold digger in the room our mother died in." "Yes," Walter said simply. "I did. And I am more sorry for that than I know how to say out loud. I thought I was protecting her. I think somewhere along the way I convinced myself that protecting her meant I didn't owe the rest of you the truth yet. I was wrong. I see that now, sitting in this hallway, watching all of your faces." Claire had tears streaming silently down her face, but her voice, when it came, was sharp. "And the man at the gate? The note on your windshield? Are you going to tell us about that too, or should we keep guessing?" Walter's expression darkened instantly. "What note?" I stepped forward and told him about the man in the fog, about the torn scraps of paper I'd pieced together off the kitchen counter at midnight, about the fragments I could make out. Walter's face went from exhausted to something closer to alarm. "That's Derek Voss," he said quietly. "Margaret's second husband, Ivy's stepfather, the one who called me when Margaret died." He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. "He wasn't a good man to either of them, from what I've since learned. Margaret finally left him about 2 years before she died, took Ivy and moved 3 states away to get free of him. He's been trying to reinsert himself into Ivy's life, and by extension, into whatever money he assumes comes with the Whitfield name, ever since he found out who her biological father actually was. Ivy is terrified of him, genuinely terrified. That's part of why the secrecy mattered so much to her. She didn't just want privacy from the press. She wanted to be impossible for Derek to find." The doctor, who had been standing quietly to the side through all of this, cleared her throat gently. "I don't want to interrupt a clearly overdue family conversation, but I do need to mention, hospital security flagged a man attempting to access patient information at the front desk about 20 minutes ago, using the name Sinclair. He didn't have ID matching hospital records, and security asked him to leave. He didn't cause a scene, but he didn't seem inclined to give up easily either." Every head in that waiting room turned toward the double doors at once. Walter was on his feet and moving before the doctor had even finished her sentence. Daniel and I followed, leaving Claire and Marcus behind in the waiting room. We found Derek Voss standing near the hospital's main entrance, arguing in a low, controlled voice with a security guard twice his size. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of restless, wiry energy of a man who'd spent a lot of his life being told no, and had never once actually accepted it. The moment he spotted Walter, his whole posture shifted, the frustration melting into something almost pleasant. "Walter, there you are. I was starting to think you were avoiding me." "You need to leave," Walter said, his voice flat and hard. "Now, before I have this man call the police instead of just security." Derek held both hands up, all mock innocence. "I'm just here checking on my stepdaughter. Is that a crime now?" "You have no legal relationship to Ivy anymore," Walter said. "Margaret's divorce filing severed that the day it was finalized. You are not her family. You are not entitled to information about her medical status. And if you come near this hospital again, I will file for a restraining order so fast your head will spin." Derek's pleasant mask cracked just slightly at that, something colder showing through underneath. "That's a real shame, Walter, because I've got quite a bit of information about your family that I think a lot of people would find fascinating. Old letters from Margaret. Some interesting financial records from back when you were sending her that hush money every quarter for 20 years. I've been very patient with you. Very patient. But patience isn't free, and my patience runs out fast when I keep getting told no." "That's extortion," I said before I could stop myself. "You do understand that's a felony, right?" Derek's eyes flicked to me, sizing me up, dismissing me almost instantly as unimportant. "It's a conversation between families, sweetheart. Nothing more." Daniel stepped forward, close enough that Derek had to tilt his chin up slightly to hold eye contact. "You're not family. You heard my father. Get out of this hospital, or I will personally make sure the next conversation you have is with the Newport PD." For a moment, something dangerous flickered behind Derek's eyes, the look of a man calculating whether the payoff was worth the risk of pushing further right now, in a public hospital lobby with witnesses and security cameras everywhere. He must have decided it wasn't. He took a slow step back, straightened his jacket with exaggerated care, and gave Walter one last, unhurried look. "You've got my number, Walter. I'll expect to hear from you." He walked out through the automatic doors and disappeared into the parking lot, unbothered, unhurried, exactly the way he'd stood at our gate 2 weeks earlier. Walter watched him go, his jaw tight. "I need to call my lawyer in the morning, get a restraining order filed, and get ahead of whatever he thinks he's holding over me." "Dad," Daniel said quietly, "why didn't you tell any of us this was happening? Any of it? The blackmail, Ivy, all of it. We could have helped you deal with this weeks ago instead of tearing each other apart at the dinner table." Walter was quiet for a long moment, watching the empty spot in the parking lot where Derek's car had been. "Because I've spent 40 years building a reputation in this town, in this industry, based on the idea that Walter Whitfield does not have skeletons. I convinced myself that admitting I had an illegitimate daughter I'd hidden from my own family for over a year would be more damaging than anything Derek could do to us. I was protecting my pride, and I dressed it up as protecting Ivy. Those aren't always the same thing. And I only just started being honest with myself about that tonight." We stood there together in the hospital parking lot, the three of us, in a silence that felt different from every other silence that had passed between us over the last month. Less angry, more exhausted. Something that might, eventually, with enough time, become the beginning of forgiveness. We got home a little after 4 in the morning, the sky already starting to gray at the edges over the water. Claire and Marcus had left the hospital an hour before us, once the doctors confirmed Ivy was stable and resting. I expected to find the house dark and quiet. Instead, I found Claire sitting at the kitchen island in her robe, a mug of untouched tea in front of her, staring at nothing. "You should be asleep," I said gently, sitting across from her. "I can't." She wrapped both hands around the mug without drinking from it. "Lena, I said such awful things to that girl. I called her a liar to her face. I told her not to speak to me. And she's been sitting in that room dying, and I never once thought to ask why she looked so sick, because I was too busy being angry that Dad might be giving away money I felt entitled to." Her voice cracked. "What kind of person does that make me?" "A scared one," I said. "Fear makes people cruel long before it makes them honest. You're not the only one in this house who got that order backwards this month." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and, in a small, almost embarrassed voice, said, "Marcus had me sign something tonight, at the hospital while we were waiting. I didn't really read it, I was too upset. And he said it was just a standard emergency authorization in case something happened to Dad while we were all distracted with Ivy. Something about protecting my shares during a family crisis." Every instinct I'd built over 14 years of forensic accounting snapped instantly to attention. "Do you still have it? Or a copy?" She nodded toward her handbag on the counter. I pulled the folded papers out with hands that weren't quite steady and read through them right there at the kitchen island twice to make absolutely sure I wasn't misreading it out of exhaustion and adrenaline. It wasn't an emergency authorization. It was a limited power of attorney, drafted by an attorney I didn't recognize, granting Marcus Ashford voting control over Claire's entire block of Whitfield Group shares for a period of 3 years. In the event of demonstrated family crisis affecting the sound governance of the company. The definition of demonstrated family crisis in the document was so broad, it could have applied to almost anything. A medical emergency, a public relations issue, even, I noted with a chill, matters of disputed familial legitimacy. A phrase that could only have been written with Ivy specifically in mind. Claire had signed it at 1:47 that morning, according to the notary stamp, sitting in a hospital waiting room in the middle of the worst night of her family's recent history, while her husband stood beside her, murmuring reassurances about protecting her interests. "Claire," I said carefully, "did you read this document before you signed it?" "No," she admitted, small and ashamed. "He said it was routine. He said his lawyer drew it up weeks ago just in case, and that tonight proved exactly why we needed it in place. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I trust him? He's my husband." I didn't answer that question out loud, because the honest answer would have broken something in her that I didn't think she was ready to have broken at 4 a.m. after the night she'd just lived through. Instead, I said, "I need to make some calls tomorrow. I need you to trust me on this, and I need you not to mention this document to Marcus until I tell you it's okay to." She looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind her exhausted eyes. Not quite suspicion yet, but the first crack of it. "Lena, what do you think is going on?" "I think," I said slowly, "that your husband has been planning for a crisis in this family for a lot longer than tonight." I didn't sleep that night. By 6 a.m, I was in the home office with 3 cups of coffee and Claire's power of attorney spread out across the desk beside my laptop, cross-referencing the notary's license number, the attorney's bar registration, and the exact legal language against every estate document the Whitfield Group had on file. Everything about it was technically legal. That was almost worse. Marcus hadn't forged anything. He'd simply waited for the worst possible night of his wife's life and put a pen in her hand at exactly the right moment. I woke Daniel at 7 and laid it all out for him. The document, the timestamp, the notary, the language broad enough to swallow Claire's entire inheritance whole. He read it twice, his face going through several distinct stages of disbelief before settling into something cold and focused that reminded me, unsettlingly, of his father. "We need to know if this connects to anything else," he said. "Get into the company systems. See if Marcus has been moving money anywhere unusual." We drove to the Whitfield Group's Providence headquarters together that morning, skipping the house entirely, and I had our systems administrator, a sharp young woman named Priya who'd worked with me for 6 years and whom I trusted completely, pull the internal financial logs under Daniel's executive authorization. It took less than 20 minutes to find what we were looking for. 8 weeks earlier, nearly 2 full weeks before Walter had even announced the wedding at that first dinner, a shell company called Ashford Meridian Consulting had been registered in Delaware. The listed director was Marcus Ashford. Over the following 6 weeks, 4 separate wire transfers totaling just over $60,000 had moved out of that account. 3 of them to a private legal firm specializing in family trust litigation, and 1, a single transfer of $8,000 to an account belonging to a woman named Renata Pierce. "Pierce," Daniel said slowly, reading the name off the screen. "Grant Pierce, our systems technician." "His wife," Priya confirmed, pulling up the account holder details. "Same address as Grant Pierce's employee file." I felt something cold settle into my stomach. He's had someone inside our own security infrastructure this entire time. We pulled the internal access logs for the residential smart home server next, the same system Grant had used to disable the east hallway cameras the night Ivy moved in. Buried in the access history, we found it. Grant's administrator account had logged into the residential server at 1:17 in the morning, 2 nights before the crisis, exported a data file at 1:23, and wiped the local export history at 1:30. All while Walter and everyone else in the house was asleep. "What did he export?" Daniel asked, leaning over my shoulder. Priya scrolled through the metadata. "Archived footage and sensor logs from before the cameras were disabled, plus what looks like partial medical monitoring data, pulled from the emergency call system logs, timestamps of when the button was triggered, when the medicine cabinet was accessed, that kind of thing." I stared at the screen, piecing it together in real time. He didn't need the footage to prove anything happened. He needed footage that could be cropped and reassembled to make it look like something happened. A door that stays shut for days, cabinet access logs with no context around them, an emergency alarm with no explanation attached. String enough of that together out of order, hand it to the right person, and you don't need a single fabricated frame. You just need real data with all the context surgically removed. Enough to make it look like Dad was holding a teenage girl against her will. Daniel finished, his voice flat with disgust. Enough to hand straight to Derek Voss. "Bring him in," Daniel said, his hand already reaching for his phone. "Not to the boardroom," I said, stopping him. "Bring him to the server room. No audience, no yelling, just the data. People tell the truth faster when they're staring at proof instead of an accusation." 15 minutes later, Grant Pierce walked into the server room looking like a man walking to his own sentencing. He saw Daniel, saw me, saw Priya standing quietly by the racks of humming equipment, and something in his shoulders sagged before anyone had said a single word. Daniel slid a printed copy of the access logs across the table without preamble. "Explain this." Grant's hands shook slightly as he picked up the paper. I was just running routine maintenance diagnostics. That's all it was." I set the wire transfer record down next to the logs. $8,000. Transferred to your wife's account from a company called Ashford Meridian Consulting 2 days before you exported this data. That's not routine maintenance, Grant. That's a paper trail. He didn't try to argue after that. He sank into the nearest chair, put his head in his hands, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the low, steady hum of server fans. "I'm sorry," he finally said, muffled behind his palms. "Marcus said Claire needed it, needed proof, in case her father tried to cut her and Daniel out of the estate without warning. He said it would stay completely internal, that it was just insurance for the family. I have a son with a heart condition, Daniel. His surgery bills alone this year were $40,000 our insurance wouldn't touch. My wife hasn't worked in 8 months because somebody has to be with him full time. When Marcus offered me money to pull some data I already had legitimate access to anyway, it didn't feel like stealing. It felt like, I don't know, like I was just doing a favor for family." "You don't know who Derek Voss is, do you?" I said quietly. It wasn't really a question. Grant looked up, genuinely confused. "Who?" "He's the man Marcus actually gave that data to," Daniel said. "Or arranged to get it to, one way or another. A man currently trying to extort my father using exactly the footage and logs you exported." The color drained completely out of Grant's face. "I didn't. I swear to you, I never met anyone named Derek. I gave the export file to Marcus directly, in person, at a coffee shop off Thames Street. That's it. That's all I did. He told me exactly what to filter out before I handed it over. Strip the medical monitoring data, strip anything referencing the doctor's remote access codes, leave in the raw camera-disabled timestamps and the locked door duration. He said he just needed a clean record showing the room had been sealed off with no outside access for an extended period. That was it. I didn't ask what it was for. I should have. I know that now." Daniel's jaw was tight enough that I could see the muscle working beneath his skin, but he stayed where he was, hands flat on the table, letting the silence do its work instead of his temper. "I need you to write all of this down," I said to Grant, sliding a legal pad across the table. "Every detail. What you were asked to filter out, how much you were paid, where you met him, what he told you the data was for. Everything. In your own words, and then you sign it." Grant nodded, already reaching for the pen, tears standing in his eyes. "Am I going to lose my job?" Neither of us answered him right away, because the honest truth was that neither of us actually knew yet, not with Marcus's fingerprints all over this instead of Grant's, and a 9-year-old boy at home who needed his father's insurance more than any of us needed to make an example out of a desperate man who'd made one terrible decision under enormous financial pressure. Daniel finally said, quietly, "That depends on how honest you are on that page. Start writing." We got back to the house a little after 2 in the afternoon, the folder of evidence heavy in my hands, the wire transfer records, the cropped server logs and their originals side by side, and Grant's signed confession, 3 full pages in his own cramped handwriting. Walter had come home from the hospital an hour earlier to shower and change before heading back to sit with Ivy, and he was in the living room when we walked in, along with Claire, who sat curled into the corner of the sofa looking like she hadn't slept in days, and Marcus, standing near the window with the kind of composed, patient stillness he always carried, like a man waiting for a meeting to start. He straightened when we came in, offering a small, sympathetic smile. "Long morning at the office? Everything all right with the quarterly filings?" Daniel didn't answer him. He walked straight to the coffee table and set the folder down, then opened it and spread the contents out 1 page at a time. The shell company registration, the wire transfer to Renata Pierce, the cropped access logs beside their unedited originals, and finally, Grant's signed confession laid squarely on top. The sound of that last page hitting the glass tabletop was quiet, but it landed in that room like a gunshot. "Care to explain?" Daniel said. "How a man trying to blackmail my father got his hands on security data you paid our IT technician to steal?" Marcus's expression didn't so much as flicker for a full 3 seconds. An impressive display of control, I had to admit, even in that moment. "Daniel, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Why on earth would I hand anything to a blackmailer?" I tapped the confession. "Because you told Grant Pierce exactly what to strip out of the logs, the medical data, the doctor's access codes, and you paid his wife $8,000 through a shell company registered in your own name to do it. You needed footage that looked like a young girl was being kept locked in a room against her will, so that when it inevitably found its way to Derek Voss, he'd have real, verifiable data to threaten Walter with. And once the family was in full crisis mode, panicked and desperate to make the scandal disappear quietly, you were perfectly positioned to be the calm, reasonable son-in-law who'd already had the foresight to get emergency protective paperwork signed. Paperwork that happened to hand you 3 years of voting control over your wife's entire share of this company." The room went completely silent. Claire sat up slowly on the sofa, her face draining of color in real time. "You paid him?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Marcus turned toward her, and for the first time, something genuinely uncertain crossed his face. "Claire, listen to me. They're twisting this into something it isn't." "Did you pay him?" she said again, louder this time, nearly a scream. Marcus hesitated. It was only a second, maybe less, but I watched it happen. That single beat of silence where a truthful man would have simply said no immediately, and a guilty one calculates his next move instead. That hesitation told Claire everything she needed to know, far more clearly than any confession could have. I set the final document on top of the pile. "Your firm's defaulting on its senior debt in 3 weeks, Marcus. I pulled the public filings this morning. Ashford Meridian isn't a consulting company. It's a shell you set up specifically to move money without it showing up on Claire's joint accounts, because you needed cash you couldn't explain to her, and you needed leverage over this family's assets before your creditors came looking for something to seize. This was never about protecting Claire's inheritance. This was about saving yourself from bankruptcy, using her name and her family's crisis as the vehicle to do it." That was the moment Walter's front doorbell rang. Nobody moved for a second. We were all still too deep inside the wreckage of what had just been laid bare on the coffee table. It rang a second time, longer, more insistent, and Dolores finally crossed the front hall to answer it. When she opened the door, Derek Voss was standing there, hands in his jacket pockets, a manila folder tucked under one arm, wearing the same unhurried confidence I'd watched him wear in the hospital lobby 2 nights earlier. "I believe Walter and I have some unfinished business," he said, stepping past Dolores into the front hall like he'd been invited, his eyes sweeping across the living room and landing, with unmistakable recognition, directly on Marcus. The 2 men looked at each other for a fraction of a second too long. "You 2 know each other," I said. It wasn't really a question by that point, but I needed to hear someone in that room actually say it out loud. Derek smiled thinly. "Marcus and I have had a few very productive conversations recently, yes. Turns out we wanted a lot of the same things out of this little family drama." He glanced at Marcus. "Though it looks like your friend here didn't hold up his end quite as cleanly as he promised." "I have no idea what he's talking about," Marcus said quickly, but The words came out too fast, too high, all of his earlier polish suddenly gone. Walter's voice cut through the room, low and dangerous in a way I'd only heard him use once before, years ago, during a hostile takeover attempt that had nearly cost the company its Boston division. "Sit down, Derek. Right there, in that chair. And don't move again until the police arrive, because I called then the moment Dolores told me you were at my door." Derek's smile faltered for the first time. He glanced toward the front door, calculating. The same calculation I'd watched him run through in the hospital parking lot 2 nights before. But this time there was no crowd of strangers to disappear into, no public lobby to slip out of unnoticed, just a locked front gate, a long gravel driveway, and 4 adults who had absolutely no intention of letting him walk out of that house before the authorities arrived. He sat. The next 20 minutes unfolded in a strange, brittle quiet. All of us waiting in that living room together, Walter in his armchair, Claire curled into the corner of the sofa with tears silently sliding down her face, Marcus standing rigid by the window like a man who'd finally run out of clever things to say, and Derek slouched in a dining chair Dolores had dragged in from the other room, his earlier bravado curdling slowly into something closer to sullen resignation. When the 2 Newport patrol officers finally arrived, Walter's attorney, a sharp, silver-haired man named Mr. Callahan, who'd represented the family for 25 years, was right behind them, having driven over the moment Walter called. Mr. Callahan reviewed the folder of evidence Daniel and I had assembled with the calm efficiency of a man who had seen far worse in his career, then turned to the officers. "Extortion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and knowingly receiving illegally obtained private data," he said. "I'll be filing the full complaint with the district attorney's office by end of day, along with everything relevant to Mr. Pierce's role, given his cooperation and full written confession." The officers led Derek out first, his hands cuffed loosely in front of him, his composure finally completely gone, muttering something under his breath about lawyers and unfair treatment that nobody in that room bothered to listen to. "Marcus didn't get arrested that afternoon." Mr. Callahan explained quietly that the wire transfer records and Grant's confession would need to go through the DA's office before any charges against him could be formally filed. But the look on Claire's face as she watched her husband stand there, exposed and silent, told me that whatever charges the state eventually decided to pursue, Marcus's marriage had already reached its own verdict. After the police cars pulled away, Claire stood up from the sofa, walked over to where Marcus was still standing by the window, and held out her left hand, palm up, without a word. He looked at her for a long moment, understanding exactly what she was asking for, and slowly slid his wedding ring off his finger and set it in her palm. She closed her fingers around it, walked to the fireplace, and set it down on the mantel. Not thrown, not dramatic, just set down, quiet and final. The way you'd put down something that had gotten too heavy to keep carrying. "Pack a bag," she told him. "You have until tonight. I'll have Mr. Callahan send the divorce paperwork to whatever address you give him." "Claire, I signed a document giving you control over my inheritance while I was sitting in a hospital waiting room, terrified my father was going to die, and you used that fear like it was a business opportunity." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I don't need you to explain yourself to me. I need you to leave." He looked around the room once more, at Walter, who wouldn't meet his eyes, at Daniel, whose expression hadn't softened once through the entire afternoon, at me, standing quietly by the coffee table with the folder that had ended everything for him, resting under my hand. Then he picked up his jacket, and he walked out the front door, into the gray Newport afternoon. And this time, nobody followed him out to argue. Nobody called his name. The gravel crunched under his tires as he drove away, and none of us moved from where we stood until the sound of his car had faded completely into silence. Claire sank back down onto the sofa, and for a long moment she simply sat there, staring at the empty space where her husband had been standing, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Then, quietly, she started to cry. Not the sharp, angry tears of the past few weeks, but something softer, more exhausted. The kind of crying that comes after you've finally set down a weight you didn't fully realize you'd been carrying. I sat down beside her and put my arm around her shoulders, and she let me, which told me more about how far she'd fallen and how ready she was to start climbing back up than anything she could have said out loud. Ivy came home from the hospital 4 days later, once her blood counts had stabilized enough for the doctors to feel comfortable releasing her. The room at the end of the hallway had been transformed again in her absence, not back into a hospital room this time, but into something that finally looked like it belonged to an actual 19-year-old. Dolores had spent an entire afternoon hanging soft yellow curtains instead of the clinical beige ones, and Claire, in a gesture that surprised all of us, had driven into town and come back with an armful of paperback novels and a second-hand record player she remembered Ivy mentioning once, in passing, during one of the few conversations they'd had before everything fell apart. The medical equipment stayed: the emergency call button, the medicine cabinet, the air purifier humming quietly in the corner, because Ivy's condition hadn't disappeared just because the lies around it had. But the door, for the first time since she'd arrived, was left standing open. I found her sitting up in bed that first evening, looking out the window at the water the way you'd look at something you'd forgotten still existed. She turned when she heard me in the doorway, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. "I owe you an apology," I said finally. "None of us treated you the way you deserve to be treated. And I don't think we didn't know the full story excuses how cruel this house was to you for a month." She looked down at her hands, the same nervous gesture I'd seen from Walter a dozen times without ever connecting the two of them until now. "I made it worse. I know I did. I could have told you all the truth the first week, and I chose not to, because I was so scared of what people would think of me. A sick girl showing up out of nowhere claiming to be Walter Whitfield's secret daughter. I thought it would sound like I was making it up for money, no matter how I explained it. It felt easier to let everyone believe something humiliating about me than to risk you all believing something worse." "What's worse than what we believed?" She was quiet for a long moment. "That you'd think I was lying about being sick to get sympathy? That you'd run every test, ask every doctor, treat me like I was scamming a dying man's affection out of him, when the whole time I never once asked him for anything, except to help me stay alive long enough to finish my transplant evaluation. I've watched people treat sick people like liars my whole life, ever since I was 17 and too broke to afford my own medication. I didn't think a family with this much money would believe me any faster." I sat down in the chair beside her bed. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're lying about any of it. And I don't think being scared and 19, and trying to protect yourself from a world that's already hurt you is something you owe anybody an apology for. The people who owe you an apology are sitting downstairs feeling appropriately terrible about it right now." That got the faintest ghost of a smile out of her, the first one I'd seen since she arrived at that house a month earlier. Claire came to Ivy's room that same evening, a little while after I left. I know because Dolores told me about it the next morning, standing in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she'd forgotten to drink. Claire had stood in the doorway for a long time, apparently, holding a bowl of soup she'd insisted on making herself instead of letting Dolores do it, unable to quite meet Ivy's eyes. "I'm sorry," Claire had said, according to Dolores, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm so ashamed of what I said to you, the things I called you, the way I treated you like you'd done something wrong just by existing. I let my grief over my mother and my own fear about the money turn me into someone I don't recognize. Ivy had looked at her for a long moment, quiet, and then simply nodded. There were no hugs, no dramatic reconciliation, nothing tied up neatly with a bow. But for two people who had spent a month being carefully, deliberately turned against each other by someone else's greed, a quiet nod and an accepted bowl of soup was its own kind of door opening. Over the following weeks, that door stayed open a little wider each time. Claire started stopping by Ivy's room in the evenings, first with small excuses, a magazine she thought Ivy might like, a question about which television show to put on, and eventually, without any excuse at all, just to sit together in comfortable silence while the sun went down over the water. I watched their relationship rebuild itself, slowly, unevenly, the way anything real actually does. Nothing like the instant forgiveness you see in movies, but something sturdier for having been built one careful, awkward evening at a time. Daniel took longer to come around. He wasn't cruel to Ivy. He'd never been cruel to her, not really. His anger had always been aimed at his father rather than at her. But he kept a careful, polite distance for the first few weeks. The way you might treat a new coworker you weren't sure yet whether to trust. It was Ivy, in the end, who closed that distance herself, catching him alone in the kitchen one evening while he was making coffee and asking, quietly, if he'd tell her about their mother. "I never got to have one that stuck around," she said. "I'd like to know what she was like, if you don't mind telling me." Daniel had stood there for a long moment, coffee pot forgotten in his hand, and then he'd pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and started talking about Eleanor's terrible taste in reality television, about the way she used to burn the first pancake of every batch on purpose because she said it was a sacrifice to the pancake gods, about how she used to leave the porch light on every single night, regardless of the weather, because she said a house should always look like someone was glad you were coming home to it. Dolores told me she'd stood in the hallway and listened to the two of them talk for almost an hour, and that it was the first time in over a year she'd heard Daniel laugh about a memory of his mother instead of going quiet whenever her name came up. 3 weeks after the confrontation in the living room, Walter called a family meeting. Not a dinner this time, no roast, no clam chowder, no candle lit beneath Eleanor's portrait before anyone sat down to eat. Just the 5 of us gathered in his study on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Walter, Daniel, Claire, Ivy, well enough now to sit up in a regular chair instead of propped against pillows, and me. Mr. Callahan sat off to one side with a stack of documents in front of him, and I understood immediately that whatever was about to happen, it had been prepared with the same care Walter brought to every major business decision he'd ever made. "I've spent the last month thinking about the difference between protecting my family and controlling the story my family gets to hear," Walter said, standing at the head of the room the way he might have addressed a boardroom, except his hands, I noticed, weren't quite steady. "I told myself for over a year that keeping Ivy a secret was an act of protection, protecting her privacy, protecting this family's reputation, protecting all of you from a scandal I was ashamed of. What I actually did was protect my own pride at the cost of nearly destroying every relationship I have. I'm not going to make that mistake again." He nodded to Mr. Callahan, who began distributing copies of a revised estate plan to each of us. "Everything Eleanor left specifically to Daniel and Claire remains completely untouched," Walter continued. "Not a single share, not a single property moves out of what your mother intended for the two of you. That was never negotiable, and I should have said that clearly to both of you from the very first night, instead of letting fear and silence do the talking for me." Claire looked up from the document in her hands, something cautious and hopeful crossing her face. And Ivy? My personal assets, the ones that were always mine alone to divide, separate from what Eleanor left behind, are being restructured to establish an irrevocable medical trust in Ivy's name, fully funded and independently managed, so that, regardless of what happens with the transplant, regardless of what happens to me, her care is never dependent on anyone's goodwill again. He looked at Ivy directly. And I filed a paternity acknowledgement with the family court this week. Formally, legally, publicly, if it comes to that. You are my daughter, Ivy. I should have said that with my whole chest the day I met you, instead of hiding you behind a story neither of us believed in. I'm sorry it took nearly destroying this family for me to understand that the secret was never protecting you. It was only ever protecting me. Ivy sat very still for a long moment, her eyes bright, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out unsteady. I don't want anyone's shares. I never wanted that. I just wanted my actual name attached to something true for once in my life. And I wanted my mom to be able to rest without me carrying around a lie she spent her whole life trying to protect me from. Daniel, sitting across the room, didn't say much. He read through his copy of the document carefully, twice, the same careful, methodical way he approached every contract at the office, and then he simply nodded once and set it down. He didn't hug his father. He didn't tell him it was all forgiven. But he stayed in that room until the meeting ended, and when it did, he was the one who walked over to Ivy's chair and offered his hand to help her up. An unspoken gesture that meant more, I think, than any words either of them could have found in that moment. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't arrive as a grand, tearful embrace. Sometimes it just looks like people choosing, quietly and deliberately, not to walk away. The transplant itself happened 9 weeks later at a specialized hospital outside Boston. Once Walter's tissue typing came back as a confirmed match, and Ivy's blood counts had stabilized enough for her medical team to greenlight the procedure. I won't pretend I understood most of what the transplant coordinator explained to us in the pre-op consultation room. Something about conditioning regimens and stem cell harvesting and engraftment windows that all blurred together into the kind of dense medical language that makes you nod along while privately hoping someone will translate it into plain English later. What I did understand, sitting in that waiting room with Daniel's hand wrapped tightly around mine, was the fear on Walter's face as they wheeled him into a separate procedure room to harvest the marrow that would, if everything went the way the doctors hoped, save his daughter's life. Claire sat with Ivy before they took her back for the transplant infusion, holding her hand, keeping up a steady stream of gentle, distracting conversation about nothing in particular, a television show they'd both started watching together over the past few weeks, an argument about which Newport beach had the best clam shack, anything to keep Ivy's mind from drifting toward the fear that comes with watching a bag of donated cells slowly enter your bloodstream and knowing your entire future depends on how your body decides to respond to it. The procedure itself, from what the nurses explained afterward, was almost anticlimactic in its physical simplicity. The actual infusion of the harvested marrow took less than 2 hours, a slow drip through an IV line, nothing like the dramatic surgical scene I think all of us had unconsciously braced ourselves for. The real waiting game came after, in the weeks that followed, watching Ivy's blood counts on a chart each morning like a family watching a stock ticker, waiting to see whether her body would accept what her father had given her or reject it entirely. Walter visited her every single day during that recovery period, sitting beside her hospital bed in a hospital-mandated mask and gown, reading to her from whatever paperback happened to be sitting on the nightstand, sometimes just sitting in silence while she slept. Dolores told me later that she'd never, in 22 years of working for the Whitfield family, seen Walter sit still that long, for that many consecutive days, for anyone. 28 days after the infusion, the transplant coordinator called the family into a small consultation room and delivered the news we'd all been holding our breath for since the whole ordeal began. Ivy's counts were climbing steadily. No signs of rejection, no major complications. Full engraftment. Her immune system, quite literally, was rebuilding itself out of her father's cells. Ivy cried when she heard the news, and then, a moment later, so did Walter. And I don't think I'd ever seen him cry before in the 14 years I'd known him. Not at Eleanor's funeral, not at either of his grandchildren's christenings, not once in any circumstance I could remember. He just sat there in that small consultation room with tears running freely down his face, holding his daughter's hand, and none of us said a word, because there wasn't anything left to say that the moment itself wasn't already saying far better. The legal fallout took longer to resolve than any of us expected, the way these things always seem to drag on far past the point where you feel like you've already lived through the worst of it. Derek Voss was indicted on charges of extortion and conspiracy within a month. And rather than risk a trial with Grant's signed confession, the wire transfer records, and the torn note I'd pieced back together from the trash bin, all sitting in the prosecution's file, he eventually took a plea deal that put him behind bars for 18 months, with a permanent restraining order barring him from any contact with Ivy for the rest of his life. Walter told me privately that he felt no satisfaction watching the sentencing hearing, only a tired kind of relief, the way you feel when a storm finally passes through, rather than any real sense of victory. Marcus's case moved slower, tangled up in the more complicated question of exactly how much of what he'd done crossed the line into criminal fraud versus merely reprehensible personal conduct. In the end, the district attorney's office charged him with conspiracy related to the illegally obtained security data, and rather than fight it in court with his failing business already collapsing under its own debt, he accepted a plea agreement that spared him significant prison time in exchange for a felony conviction, a substantial fine, and 5 years of probation. His name was quietly, permanently removed from every filing associated with the Whitfield Group. His firm folded within the year, exactly as I'd predicted the day I pulled his loan documents. Claire's divorce was finalized a few months after that, uncontested, clean, and by the time the papers were signed, she told me she felt less like she'd lost a husband and more like she'd successfully removed a splinter she'd been ignoring for years. Grant Pierce kept his job, though not without consequences. Walter, after a long conversation with Daniel and me about it, decided against pursuing criminal charges against him, given his full cooperation, his written confession, and the circumstances that had driven him to accept Marcus's money in the first place. He was placed on a formal disciplinary probation, stripped of his administrator-level access to the residential security systems for 2 years, and required to complete an ethics review before regaining any of his previous responsibilities. Walter also, quietly and without telling anyone except me, arranged for the Whitfield Group's employee health plan to fully cover the remaining costs of Grant's son's cardiac treatment. Not as a bribe, not as a reward, but as what he called, when I asked him about it, the decent thing to do for a man whose desperation I helped create by keeping secrets that put him in an impossible position to begin with. "You don't owe him that," I told him. "No," Walter agreed. "But I've spent this whole year learning the difference between what I'm legally obligated to do and what I actually owe the people my choices have hurt. I'd like to start paying down that second column a little more often." Almost a year passed before I really felt like our family had settled into whatever its new normal was going to be. Claire moved out of the house she'd shared with Marcus and into a smaller place closer to the water, a decision she said had less to do with money and more to do with wanting walls that didn't remind her of a version of herself she was actively trying to leave behind. She started spending more time at the company, too, something none of us had expected. She'd never shown much interest in the family business before, always more focused on the social side of Whitfield life than the operational side. But watching the aftermath of Marcus's scheme seemed to wake something up in her. She asked me, one afternoon over coffee, if I'd be willing to teach her the basics of reading a balance sheet properly. "I never want to sign something I don't understand again," she said, and I recognized in that sentence the exact shape of a lesson learned the hard way, the kind that sticks with you far longer than any lesson learned easily ever could. Ivy, for her part, spent that year doing the things she'd wanted to do from the very beginning, before any of this ever started, quietly getting better. Her blood count stabilized fully by the 6-month mark, and by the time the leaves started turning that October, her doctors cleared her to enroll in classes at the local community college, starting slow, part-time, exactly the ordinary, unremarkable life she'd been chasing since the day her mother died and left her alone with a diagnosis and no safety net. She moved out of the house at the end of the east hallway that same fall, into a small apartment near campus that Walter helped her secure, but that she insisted on paying rent for herself, using money from a part-time job at a local bookstore rather than a single cent of the trust fund sitting untouched in her name. "I want that money there in case I ever really need it," she told me the week she moved out, boxes stacked around her in the hallway. "But I don't want to build my whole identity around being someone who needs it. I spent my whole childhood being someone people either pitied or dismissed because of money we didn't have. I don't want to spend my 20s being someone people resent because of money I do have. I just want to be a person for a while." Daniel drove the moving truck himself that day, refusing to let anyone hire movers, insisting on carrying the heaviest boxes up 3 flights of stairs, even though Ivy told him repeatedly that she was perfectly capable of hiring someone. Watching him work up a sweat hauling her second-hand bookshelf up a narrow stairwell, laughing about something with her that I couldn't quite hear from where I stood at the bottom of the steps, I understood that whatever distance had existed between them in those first difficult weeks had closed completely, replaced by something that looked unmistakably like an actual sibling relationship. Bickering, teasing, showing up for each other in the unglamorous, physically exhausting ways that family actually shows up, rather than the performative kind we'd all been so good at faking around that dinner table a year earlier. The following Thanksgiving, Walter asked all of us back to the house for dinner. A real one this time, not the strange, tension-choked gathering that had started this entire ordeal 14 months earlier. Dolores spent 2 full days in the kitchen preparing more food than 5 people could possibly eat, the way she always did for holidays, insisting that a table that looked abundant was a table that felt like home, regardless of how many people were actually sitting around it. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway that afternoon, watching the scene assemble itself piece by piece, and being struck by how different it felt from that first dinner, even though almost nothing about the physical setup had actually changed. The same dining room, the same good silver laid out in careful rows, Eleanor's portrait still hanging above the mantel, the same votive candle flickering beneath it, lit by Dolores's hand exactly as it always had been. But the air in the room felt entirely different, lighter somehow, less like a held breath and more like an actual exhale. Ivy arrived first, driving herself over from her apartment near campus in the used sedan she'd bought with bookstore paychecks, carrying a pumpkin pie she'd baked herself from a recipe she said she'd found in one of her mother's old cookbooks. "It's probably terrible," she said, setting it on the counter with visible nervousness. "I have never actually made one before." It was not terrible. It was, if anything, the best pie on that table, and Walter ate 2 slices of it before dinner had even officially started, which Dolores pretended to be scandalized by while clearly delighting in watching him do it. Claire showed up next, alone, which surprised no one anymore, and immediately fell into an easy, familiar conversation with Ivy about a class Ivy was taking that semester. The two of them talking over each other with the kind of comfortable overlap that only happens between people who've genuinely stopped performing politeness for each other and started actually enjoying each other's company instead. Daniel and I arrived last, having stopped to pick up an extra bottle of wine Dolores had specifically requested, and walked into a kitchen that smelled like roasting turkey and sage and, underneath it all, the same faint trace of vanilla wax that always seemed to hang in that house whenever the family gathered. We sat down to eat a little after 4, the low autumn light coming in gold and slanted through the dining room windows, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, nobody at that table was calculating anything. Nobody was measuring their words for hidden meaning. Nobody was watching anyone else's hands for a nervous tell. Walter raised his glass at one point, midway through the meal, and said simply, "I'm grateful every single one of you is still willing to sit at this table with me." And nobody made it into a bigger moment than it needed to be. Daniel just nodded and said, "Pass the potatoes, Dad." And the whole table laughed. And that, somehow, felt like exactly the right response. Not a grand speech, not a tearful toast, just the ordinary, unremarkable comfort of a family that had fought its way back to being able to sit together without flinching. Later that evening, after the dishes had been cleared and Ivy and Claire had settled onto the back porch with mugs of coffee, still talking, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Daniel for the first time in what felt like weeks, both of us drying dishes side by side, in a silence that no longer felt like the strained, watchful silence of that terrible month, but something closer to the comfortable quiet of two people who had actually made it through something together, instead of simply surviving it separately. "I keep thinking about that first night," he said, setting a plate carefully into the cabinet. "How certain I was that my father had completely lost his mind. How angry I was at him. At you a little, honestly, for not being angrier alongside me. I couldn't understand why you kept telling me to wait, to gather more information, to not jump to conclusions." "I wasn't sure either," I admitted. "I just knew that the story everyone was telling itself didn't quite fit the facts I could actually see. The medical supplies didn't fit a gold digger narrative. The way she bowed to your mother's portrait didn't fit it either. I've spent my whole career learning that when the story and the numbers don't match up, it's almost always the story that's wrong, not the numbers." Daniel was quiet for a moment, drying the same glass longer than it needed. "I almost left, you know. Not you, the family. I seriously considered just walking away from the company, from all of it, somewhere around week 2, when it felt like every conversation in this house was a trap waiting to go off. I didn't tell you that at the time." "I know," I said. "I could see it on you. I just didn't know what to say that wouldn't make it worse." "You didn't have to say anything," he said, finally setting the glass down and turning to look at me properly. "You just kept showing up. To the dinners you didn't want to sit through. To the arguments you didn't start. To the hospital at 3 a.m. without asking a single question about whether it was really our problem to solve. I don't think I ever really understood what 'for better or worse' was supposed to mean until I watched you live it out during the worst month of my entire life." I didn't have a clever answer for that. The kind of composed, measured response I usually reached for out of habit. I just set down my own dish towel and hugged him, right there in the kitchen, the smell of turkey and sage and vanilla wax still hanging faintly in the air around us. And for a long moment, neither of us said anything else at all. Because there wasn't anything left that needed saying. A few weeks after Thanksgiving, Walter asked me to come sit with him in the study one evening, something he did occasionally when he wanted to talk through a business matter without an audience. But this time, when I sat down across from him, I could tell from the way he was turning his water glass slowly in his hands that this wasn't about the quarterly numbers. "I want to tell you something I haven't told the others," he said. "Not because it's a secret. I'm done keeping those. I just think it might land better coming from me to you first, and you can decide whether it's something Daniel and Claire need to hear." I waited. "The night I disabled those cameras," he said, "I told myself it was purely to protect Ivy's privacy. That was true, as far as it went. But there was something else underneath it that I didn't let myself examine very closely at the time. Eleanor died in that room. I sat with her every single day for the last 4 months of her life, in that bed, in that exact spot where Ivy's bed ended up being placed. And when Ivy first arrived, so sick, so frightened, needing that same kind of round-the-clock care, some part of me couldn't handle watching it happen again in front of witnesses. I disabled those cameras because I couldn't stand the idea of this family watching me lose someone else the way we lost Eleanor. It wasn't only about protecting Ivy's secret. It was about protecting myself from having to grieve in public twice. His voice caught slightly on that last sentence, something I had genuinely never heard happen in 14 years of knowing this man through boardrooms, family crises, and one exceptionally tense corporate merger negotiation that had gone on for 11 straight hours. "You should have told us that," I said gently. "Not the whole truth about Ivy, maybe, not right away. I understand why that part took time. But that part about Eleanor, about being scared of losing someone again in front of all of us. Daniel would have understood that faster than anything else you could have said." "I know that now," Walter said. "I think I've spent so many decades being the person who handles things, who fixes problems quietly and efficiently and never lets anyone see the mechanism behind the fix, that I forgot my own children might actually want to help carry something instead of just being protected from it. Eleanor used to tell me that near the end. She said, 'Walter, you've spent our whole marriage trying to shield everyone from every hard thing, and one day you're going to shield them right out of the room when they needed to be standing beside you the most.' I didn't understand what she meant until this year. I understand it perfectly now." We sat together in that study for a long time after that, not saying much else. And I found myself thinking about all the ways grief reshapes a person without ever announcing that it's doing so. How a man who spent his whole career building systems with no blind spots had built the deepest blind spot of his life directly into his own grief, simply because he'd never learned any other way to survive losing someone he loved. That same winter, while helping Ivy sort through a storage unit she'd finally decided she was ready to deal with, the last of her mother's belongings, packed away since Margaret's death and shipped out to Rhode Island but never fully unpacked, she found a shoebox of letters tucked at the bottom of a cedar chest that had belonged to her grandmother. Most of them were ordinary things: old birthday cards, a few photographs of Margaret as a young woman that Ivy had never seen before, looking startlingly like her daughter around the eyes. But near the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope with Ivy's name written on the front in handwriting Ivy said she recognized instantly as her mother's, and beneath her name, a note: "Only open this if you ever decide to find him." She called me before she opened it, oddly enough, rather than Walter or Daniel or Claire, and asked if I would come sit with her while she read it, because she said she trusted me to tell her honestly whether she should share it with the rest of the family or keep it private. I drove over that same afternoon. The letter, when she finally opened it, was 3 pages long, written in the unhurried, careful handwriting of someone who had clearly drafted it more than once before committing to a final version. Margaret had written it, according to the date at the top, almost 6 years before she died, long before Ivy's diagnosis, long before any of us knew this crisis was coming. Ivy read it out loud to me, her voice unsteady in places. Margaret wrote about the engagement that had fallen apart, admitting, with more grace than Walter had given himself credit for, that she bore just as much responsibility for that failure as he did. Two 24-year-olds who simply weren't ready for each other yet, both too proud and too frightened to say so honestly at the time. She wrote about her decision not to tell Walter about the pregnancy right away, admitting it had come from her own fear more than any real malice, a fear that money and reputation would swallow her daughter's identity before Ivy ever had the chance to build one of her own. And she wrote, in the final paragraph, something that made Ivy's voice finally break entirely. If you ever do decide to find him, sweetheart, I hope you'll approach it with an open heart instead of the anger I sometimes carried about it over the years. He wasn't a bad man. He was a frightened, ambitious young man who made a mistake, the way most of us do at that age, and then spent the rest of his life quietly trying to make up for it in the only way I'd let him, a check every quarter that I was too proud to cash. And I regret that pride more than almost anything else I've done in my life. Don't inherit my pride, Ivy. It cost me more than it ever protected. Ivy sat with the letter in her lap for a long time after she finished reading it, and I simply sat beside her, not saying anything, letting the silence hold whatever it needed to hold. Eventually, she folded it carefully back into its envelope and said, quietly, I think Dad should read this. I think it might help him stop carrying quite so much guilt about all of it. She was right. When Walter read that letter a few days later, sitting alone in his study with the door closed, Dolores told me he stayed in there for almost 2 hours afterward, and when he finally came out, his eyes were red, but something in his shoulders looked lighter than it had in over a year. The particular relief, I think, of finally being forgiven by someone you never expected forgiveness from, delivered years after her death, in her own handwriting, exactly when he needed it most. The room at the end of the east hallway looks nothing like it used to. Not like it did during Eleanor's final months. Not like it did during those terrible weeks when Ivy was hidden away behind a locked electronic door. And not even quite like the yellow-curtained bedroom Dolores decorated the week Ivy came home from the hospital. These days, it's mostly empty. A guest room now, plain and unremarkable. The medical equipment finally cleared out once Ivy's transplant recovery was confirmed complete, and her doctors decided the round-the-clock monitoring equipment was no longer necessary. Dolores put a potted fig tree by the window a while back, saying the room needed something alive in it after everything that room had witnessed. It's grown almost to the ceiling by now. I still think about that room more than I probably should, given how ordinary it's become. Whenever I walk past it, I remember the sound of Daniel's shoulder hitting that door, the crack of the frame giving way, the sight of Walter on his knees on the floor, with his daughter convulsing in his arms. I think about how close we came to never getting an explanation for any of it. How easily this whole family could have simply shattered along the fault lines Marcus was so patiently, so deliberately widening, if that door had stayed locked just a little longer. If Ivy's crisis that night hadn't forced everything into the open before Marcus's scheme had time to fully mature. The house itself still runs exactly the way it always has. The gates recognize our cars, the blinds rise at 6 every morning without fail. The cameras track every step across the courtyard, their small red lights blinking steady and constant, no blind spots left anywhere in the system. Walter had the entire East Hallway camera network fully restored the week after Derek's arrest, And he told Mr. Callahan, in front of all of us, that he never wanted this house to have a dark zone again for as long as he lived in it. I believe him. I've watched him make good on harder promises than that one over the past year and a half. But I've come to understand something about houses like this one. Something that all the sensors and passcodes and motion-activated lighting in the world can never actually protect a family from. A house can have no blind spots on its cameras and still develop an entire wing of secrets if the people living inside it decide silence is safer than honesty. And a family can look absolutely flawless from the outside. Good silver, perfect posture, a votive candle burning beneath a beloved portrait. Right up until one sentence, spoken at exactly the wrong moment, exposes just how much of that flawlessness was only ever a performance for people who weren't paying close enough attention. 2 years out from that first terrible dinner, our family looks almost unrecognizable compared to the version of us sitting frozen around that table the night Walter announced his wedding. Claire has thrown herself fully into the business side of the Whitfield group now, and she's good at it. Sharper than any of us expected. Maybe because she spent so many years underestimated as the daughter who cared more about social calendars than balance sheets. And she seems to genuinely relish proving that assumption wrong every single quarter. She's dating someone new these days, a marine biologist named Owen, who has absolutely no interest in the family's money and has, on more than one occasion, forgotten entirely that the Whitfield group is worth what it's worth, which Claire says is precisely why she trusts him. Ivy finished her associate's degree last spring and has already been accepted to transfer into a 4-year nursing program in the fall. A choice, she told me, that came directly out of watching what good, attentive medical care had done for her own survival, and wanting to be able to give someone else that same fighting chance someday. Her blood counts have stayed stable for over a year now. She still comes to every family dinner, still bakes a pie every Thanksgiving that gets a little better each year, and still calls Walter Dad now. Easily, naturally. The word finally landing the way it always should have from the very beginning, instead of the strange, hollow "sir" she used to offer him in that locked room at the end of the hallway. Grant Pierce completed his ethics review and probation period without incident and was quietly reinstated to his full role last winter. His son's surgery, fully covered by the Whitfield Group's health plan, was a complete success. And Grant told me once, running into him in the parking lot, that he thinks about that entire ordeal every single day, not with shame exactly anymore, but as a permanent reminder of how close desperation can push an otherwise decent person toward a decision they'd never have made under any other circumstances. I believe him. I've watched him work with nothing but scrupulous, almost excessive caution ever since. Daniel and I are expecting our first child this coming spring, something we'd been quietly hoping for through most of that terrible year, without ever mentioning it out loud to each other, as though saying it might somehow jinx it during a season when everything else in our lives felt so precarious. Walter cried again when we told him, the second time in his life I've ever seen him do that. Both times over this same daughter, this same growing, healing family he nearly lost through nothing more dramatic or villainous than his own inability to say a hard truth out loud when it mattered most. On the second anniversary of Eleanor's passing, Walter asked all of us to gather in front of her portrait one more time. Not for a dinner, not for another difficult announcement, just to stand together for a few minutes the way the family used to before any of this began. Dolores lit the votive candle beneath the portrait, same as always, and we stood in a loose half circle in the front hallway. Walter, Daniel, Claire, Ivy, and me, with one hand resting lightly on the small curve of my own stomach. Walter looked up at Eleanor's painted face for a long moment before he spoke. I used to think the best way to honor you was to keep this family looking exactly the way you left it, he said. Steady, composed, no cracks showing. I understand now that you'd have hated that. You never once, in 31 years of marriage, asked me to be composed. You asked me to be honest, even when it was inconvenient, even when it embarrassed me, even when the truth made me look less impressive than I wanted to look. I got that backwards for a long time after you were gone. I think I'm finally getting it right. He turned to Daniel. I failed you by making you think your anger about protecting your mother's memory was something shameful instead of something honorable. It wasn't. It never was. He turned to Claire. I failed you by letting you believe, for years, that love in this family had to be measured out in shares and property, because I never corrected that assumption when I had the chance. That was my failure, not yours. And finally, he turned to Ivy. I failed you the longest and the worst, by making you carry a secret that was never yours to carry alone in the first place. You were the child in all of this. I was the adult who should have known better from the very beginning, and I let you shoulder the weight of my own fear for far longer than any 19-year-old should ever have to. Nobody hugged him dramatically. Nobody told him in that moment that everything was fully, instantly forgiven. But nobody walked away either, and by now, all of us understood that in this particular family, on the other side of everything we'd survived together, that quiet act of simply staying was worth more than any grand speech could have been. There was one more test the family had to face before I'd say we were truly on the other side of everything. And it came about 4 months after Marcus's plea deal, when a business reporter for a regional finance publication started asking pointed questions around Providence about unusual governance changes at the Whitfield Group and a family dispute involving an undisclosed paternity matter. Someone had talked. We never did find out for certain who, though I had my suspicions about a junior associate at Marcus's old law firm who might have wanted to see the story land somewhere public. And by the time Mr. Callahan called an emergency meeting to warn us the piece was already in editing, we had maybe 48 hours to decide how we wanted this family's most private crisis to become public knowledge. The old Walter, the one from that first terrible dinner, would have buried it. He would have hired a crisis management firm, threatened a defamation suit, spent whatever it took to keep the story dead before it ever printed. I watched him consider exactly that option out loud in Mr. Callahan's office, old habits surfacing fast under pressure. And then I watched him stop himself mid-sentence. No, he said. We're not doing that. We're not spending another dollar trying to bury a true story just because it's uncomfortable. I already tried that once, and look what it cost us. Instead, at Ivy's suggestion, and it surprised all of us that it was Ivy who proposed it, given how desperately private she'd been about all of this from the very beginning, the family decided to get ahead of the story entirely, on our own terms, rather than let a stranger's version of it define us in print. Walter released a short, plainly worded statement confirming that Ivy Sinclair was his biological daughter, that she had recently completed treatment for a serious illness with his support, and that the family considered the matter a private medical journey rather than a scandal, and had no further comment beyond wishing her continued good health. No apology, no defensive spin, no attempt to explain away the strange circumstances of her arrival in that house. Just the plain truth, offered without flinching. I thought you'd want to control every word of it, I told Ivy once the statement had gone out. She shrugged, looking more at peace with the whole idea than I expected. I spent a year hiding because I was terrified of what people would think if they knew the truth. It turns out hiding cost this family a lot more than the truth ever could have. I'd rather people know the real story and think whatever they want about it than watch this family almost fall apart again, trying to protect a version of events that was never actually that scandalous to begin with. I'm not ashamed of being sick. I'm not ashamed of who my father is. I don't see why I should have to act like I am. The story ran 2 days later, a modest, mostly factual piece buried on page 6 of the business section, generating exactly the brief flicker of curiosity and then nothing much at all. No scandal, no collapsed stock price, none of the catastrophic reputational fallout Walter had spent over a year convinced would happen if the truth ever got out. A few business partners sent quiet, kind notes of support. One reporter from a larger outlet called asking for a follow-up interview, which the family politely declined. And then, within about 2 weeks, the story simply stopped being interesting to anyone outside the 5 of us. Exactly the way most true things eventually do once you stop treating them like they need to be hidden. I don't think I ever properly thanked Dolores for everything she carried during that year, quietly, the way she carried most things in that house, without complaint, without asking for credit, simply doing the next necessary thing because someone had to, and she'd long ago decided that someone would be her. She'd worked for the Whitfield family for 22 years by the time all of this happened, hired originally by Eleanor back when Daniel and Claire were still in grade school, and she'd stayed on through Eleanor's illness, through the funeral, through every holiday and crisis and quiet Tuesday afternoon in between. I asked her once, not long after everything had settled, why she'd stayed with this family through so many hard years, instead of finding an easier, less complicated household to work for. She was folding linens in the laundry room when I asked, and she didn't look up right away, taking her time with the answer the way she took her time with most things. Families are complicated everywhere, Lena, she said finally. I worked for 2 other households before this one, both of them smaller, quieter, a lot less dramatic on the surface. But quiet on the surface doesn't mean healthy underneath. I've seen families that never raised their voices once in 20 years. And I've seen the coldness underneath that silence do more damage than any shouting match ever could. This family yells sometimes. This family makes terrible decisions sometimes. But when it matters, when someone's actually in trouble, when a door needs to get broken down at 11 at night, every single one of you shows up. That's rarer than people think. I've watched enough families come and go to know the difference. She told me, too, about the months she'd spent quietly worried sick over Ivy, without any of us fully realizing how much she'd noticed. I knew that girl wasn't eating enough to be well, she said. I knew the sound coming from that room some nights wasn't the sound of a happy new bride. I almost said something to Walter directly, more than once, and I talked myself out of it every time, telling myself it wasn't my place. I've thought about that a lot since. Sometimes the people closest to a secret are too afraid of overstepping to be the ones who finally break it open. I'm glad Daniel wasn't. When I told her that the house genuinely wouldn't have made it through that year without her steady hands keeping it running while the rest of us fell apart around her, she waved the compliment off the way she waved off most compliments, embarrassed by direct praise, the way people often are when they've spent their whole working lives being useful rather than celebrated. But I saw her smile a little to herself as she went back to folding the linens, and I understood that she'd heard me, even if she wasn't going to make a production out of admitting it. Our daughter was born on a bright, cold morning in late March, 6 weeks before her due date, and in a considerable hurry about the whole thing, which Daniel likes to say now was her way of announcing early that she was a Whitfield and had no intention of waiting patiently for anything. She was small but healthy, and by the time the whole family was allowed into the hospital room a few hours later, the space was so crowded with flowers and balloons and relatives trying to talk quietly all at once that one of the nurses eventually had to come in and gently remind everyone that the actual patient needed some peace and quiet. Walter held her first, before even Claire got a turn, cradling her with the kind of careful, slightly terrified concentration of a man who clearly hadn't held a newborn in a very long time and was determined not to mess it up in front of an audience. He didn't say much. He just looked down at her face for a long time, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were wet again. The third time in 2 years I'd watched this particular man cry, and every single time it had been over the same thing. The fierce, uncomplicated love of family, arriving late in his life in ways he hadn't let himself expect anymore. "What are you going to name her?" Claire asked, peering over his shoulder. Daniel and I had actually discussed this for months without settling on anything either of us loved enough to commit to. But standing in that hospital room, watching his father hold his newborn daughter with such careful, overwhelmed tenderness, Daniel said, almost without thinking about it first, "Eleanor. We'd like to call her Eleanor." Walter's face did something complicated at that. Grief and joy tangled together so completely that I don't think even he could have separated the two if you'd asked him to try. "Your mother would have adored her," he said quietly. And then, looking over at Ivy, standing a little apart from the rest of the group the way she still sometimes did in crowded family moments, not quite sure yet where she fit in the choreography of it all, he added, "Come here. Come meet your niece." Ivy crossed the room, and Walter carefully transferred the baby into her arms, guiding her hands into position with the exact same careful precision I imagined he'd once used arranging pill bottles in a locked medicine cabinet. Except this time, the care in his hands was entirely, uncomplicatedly joyful. Ivy looked down at baby Eleanor's small, scrunched-up face, and something in her own expression softened into an emotion I hadn't quite seen on her before. Not the wariness she'd carried through most of that first terrible year, not even the cautious warmth she'd slowly built with each of us since, but something that looked, for the first time, completely unguarded. "Hi," she said softly, to a baby who obviously couldn't understand a word of it yet. "I'm your aunt. I've got a lot of stories to tell you someday about how complicated this family can be and how worth it we all decided that complication actually was." People love to say that once trust is broken in a family, it can never be fully rebuilt. I used to believe that too, somewhere in the middle of that terrible year, standing in a hallway listening to my husband's family scream at each other over a locked door and a dying girl none of us understood yet. I don't believe it anymore. I think trust breaks all the time, in every family, in 1,000 small and large ways nobody ever talks about honestly. What actually matters isn't whether it breaks. What matters is whether the people holding the broken pieces are willing to stay in the room long enough to see whether it can be put back together into something different. Not the same shape it was before, maybe, but sturdy in its own new way, tested in a manner that softer, easier years never would have tested it. I think about that first dinner often, the one where Walter set down his fork and told us he was holding a wedding. And I think about how completely, catastrophically we all misread the situation, each of us filling in the silence with the worst possible explanation, because the worst possible explanation was easier to believe than the idea that a man we thought we knew might be hiding something out of fear rather than malice. Claire assumed greed. Daniel assumed betrayal. I assumed at various points almost every explanation except the true one, because the true one required imagining a version of Walter Whitfield that didn't match the controlled, unshakable man I'd known for 14 years. A version of him frightened enough of losing another person he loved that he'd rather let his own children hate him than risk grieving in front of an audience. Secrets in families rarely start out as malicious. Most of the ones I've watched unravel in my life started as small, understandable acts of self-protection. A parent trying to shield a child from worry. A spouse trying to spare their partner from an old shame. A patriarch trying to keep one more person from watching him fall apart. The trouble is that self-protection, left unexamined for long enough, curdles into something that looks a great deal like betrayal from the outside, even when the person keeping the secret never once intended harm. Walter didn't set out to make his children despise him. He set out to protect a frightened, sick, 19-year-old girl, and underneath that, to protect his own fragile heart from breaking in public one more time. He simply never accounted for how much damage silence does to the people standing just outside of it, filling in the blanks with fear because nobody trusted them with the truth.
And then there are the people like Marcus, who don't create secrets out of grief or fear at all, but who learn to read the cracks a family's silence leaves behind and slide themselves precisely into that gap, offering calm, reasonable-sounding advice that always, somehow, benefits them most in the end. I think about him sometimes, too, not with much sympathy left for what he tried to do, but with a kind of professional recognition that never quite leaves you once you've spent a career reading financial statements for a living. The most dangerous people in a family crisis are rarely the ones shouting the loudest. They're the ones speaking the softest, choosing every word with surgical precision, waiting patiently for a fire to catch before they ever move to fan it. I learned to watch for that pattern long before any of this happened, in 20 years of auditing other people's businesses, and it still nearly slipped right past me in my own living room. Because it's so much harder to see clearly when the person doing it is sitting across the table from you at Thanksgiving. If there's one thing I'd want anyone hearing this story to actually take away from it, it's this. Transparency is not the same thing as vulnerability, no matter how much it feels that way in the moment you're deciding whether to tell someone a hard truth. Walter spent a year believing that admitting the full, complicated reality of Ivy's existence would weaken this family, expose it, hand ammunition to anyone looking to embarrass us. What actually weakened this family was the silence itself. The locked door, the disabled cameras, the carefully rehearsed half-answers that convinced every single one of us he was hiding something shameful, when what he was actually hiding was something that deserved compassion, not suspicion. Every dollar we have, every share, every property this family holds means less than the plain, uncomfortable truth spoken out loud at the right moment to the right people before someone with worse intentions gets the chance to twist the silence into a weapon first. Money should be transparent in a family. Illness should be spoken about honestly, without shame, without the instinct to hide it behind an elaborate cover story that only makes everyone assume the worst. And love, real love, the kind that shows up at 3 a.m. to break down a door instead of standing outside it wondering what to do, should never require anyone to wear a mask of loyalty as a disguise for their own self-interest. I watched Marcus try to do exactly that for over a month, dressing his greed up in the language of protecting his wife's inheritance, and I watched how close it came to working,
simply because none of us wanted to believe someone we loved could be capable of it. The smart house by the water still runs on its schedules. The gates open when they recognize a car. The lights click on for anyone crossing the courtyard after dark. The blinds still rise at exactly 6 every morning, whether or not a single person is awake to notice. But the room at the end of the east hallway is no longer a dark zone, and neither, I think, is any other part of this family anymore. Whenever I walk past that room now, usually with a diaper bag over one shoulder and my daughter balanced on my hip, on our way to visit her grandfather for the afternoon, I remember the sound of Daniel's shoulder hitting that broken lock, and I think about how close we came to losing each other entirely inside our own silence. We didn't lose each other. We found our way, slowly, imperfectly, back to a version of family that finally matches what it always claimed to be from the outside. Not flawless, never flawless, but honest, which turned out to matter so much more.